For the past couple of videos, I have mentioned a certain comic repeatedly from time to time called Open Seasons, and I've actually done a review for it on BitChute, but I thought I would do another one for YouTube, which is this one. And I would like to first begin this by quoting Vader Reviews. Remember when they made good Star Wars crap? Unquote. Man, I miss the early 2000s. They had some good shit. I get it, Eddie. And life wasn't as depressing. But that's beside the point. This is, well, yeah, this more or less just leads into the subject of today's video, and what at the time I considered to be evidence of Star Wars' creative degradation, although certain things with how it's going now have me somewhat hopeful that that will change. Because The Mandalorian's a okay show. I think it is good. It has good acting and all that, but story-wise, it just doesn't compare to the epicness of the expanded universe, in my opinion. Not that it doesn't have some epic moments. That scene with Boba Fett in the tragedy was pretty close. But as someone on Twitter once said, expanded universe fans are probably looking at this and going, "Oh, that's cute," which is true. Boba had some pretty epic moments, but now I'm getting ahead of myself. This is supposed to be. This is about Star Wars Open Seasons. It's a review, and just me going over it and why I think you should read it. Written by Hayden Blackman, who went on to work on The Force Unleashed 1 and 2, Mafia 3, and Mafia Definitive Edition, all of which I cannot recommend vociferously enough. Penciled by Ramon Box, who also worked on comics such as Last Stand of Nord Mantell and Jedi vs. Sith. Inked by Raul Fernandez, who also worked on Jedi vs. Sith and Volume 2 of Justice League Dark. Colored by Brad Anderson, who worked on Legacy's cover with Studio F, and he colored this with Studio F. And these are just notes I'll be going over. Lettered by Digital Chameleon, covered by Ramon F. Bax, who illustrated Last Stand on Mantell and Crossbones, and published by Dark Horse Comics. And God, I wish they were still publishing this stuff. I'm hoping at some point they'll go back to it, but now into the main thing of the story, which is, whereas the Bounty Hunter game covered by Vader Reviews focused on how Jango was selected for the cloning template, this 4-part series focused on Jet's early life before becoming a simple man trying to make his way in the galaxy. Part 1 begins with Dooku meeting Sidious in his lair around the time they have begun the test which transpires in Bounty Hunter, and they're discussing the progress and finding a prime clone template. Scrotum Face is rather pleased to learn Dooku believes Jango will succeed upon learning his past. As he puts it, the most dangerous men are always orphans. The story then transfers in exposition concerning the schism to create the true Mandalorians led by Jaster Muriel, and a regressive faction of Mandalorians called Death Watch, led by Tor Vizsla, who led a coup against the Mandalorians loyal to Jaster. And this more or less covers 30 or 40 years before the Battle of Geonosis. It's a rather interesting debate between these two factions. Well, I say debate, and interesting. You see, Vizsla believed the Mandalorians should conquer the galaxy, which I could see happening with the right conditions, whereas Jaster believed Mandalorians were merely highly paid soldiers, which is also true in a way, though I'd call them highly paid soldiers of fortune. Muriel also created the Super Commando Codex, or so Wikipedia tells me. To best describe these two factions, I would have to paraphrase Bufar 191. Death Watch is a bunch of extremist assholes, while the true Mandalorians are more moderate. And the new Mandalorians are, well, that's the subject of politics and other crap for another video. The schism eventually made its way to Jango's home on Concord Dawn, and to make a long story short, his parents shuffle off their mortal coil, you don't see what happens to the sister, And young Django makes a run for it into the fields and is rescued by Jaster and his true Mandalorians. Vizsla decides to start a bonfire, so they light up the fields, and causing the young farm boy Fett to lead his new friends into an irrigation tube where they can cool off. Later, the true Mandalorians ambush Deathwatch in the nearest town. Django sets off an explosion that seemingly kills Vizsla, although Jaster couldn't find a body. The explosion was most impressive, a real blast. Django even manages to kill one of the men involved in the killing of his family. When the mayhem begins to settle down, Django is adopted by Jaster and becomes part of the true Mandalorians. Part 2 begins with the interrogation of a former true Mandalorian named Silas, telling the story after being tortured of a mission he went on the first time Django led a squad. Their dropships touch down on the planet like a small army of ODSTs against the Cordons, an army of damn dirty apes. It's a literal planet of apes, or at least an army, opposing them. Django and his squad make it into a trench. Thankfully, Montross was arrogant enough to make a frontal attack from the sky, which Fett uses for cover to move his squad into the nearby woods so they can continue to the target, only to realize it was a trap, and they are ambushed by Deathwatch. Django's squad tries to regroup with Jaster, but they get there only to see him being abandoned by Montross and gunned down by, the cowardly Vizsla, who is now missing half his scalp. The Mandalore dies in his adoptive son's arms. Montross is kicked out like a deadbeat who never contributes anything, and Django replaces Jaster as the leader of the true Mandalorians. Part 3 begins, I believe, 12 years before the Battle of Geonosis, and it focuses on Django's time on a planet called Galderon, where he and the true Mandalorians are aiding the governor with an insurrection in exchange for Vizsla's location, whom the governor had been aiding. And I'm not going to lie, the insurgents got absolutely wrecked. Like, holy shit, there was no contest. But yeah, they got wiped out, and then Django goes to get the reward. Only it turns out it's a trap, and Django is ambushed at the governor's manor, or I guess it's a castle. He escapes, but the Jedi have dispatched a task force after being told the Mandalorians are killing political activists, women, and children, all of which are lies. Sort of. Turns out the insurrectionists may have just been activists who the governor was seen as a nuisance and needed to be rid of. The task force arrives, led by Master Dooku, who offers them fair treatment if they surrender. But his loudmouth apprentice, Kamari Vorsa, promises her idea of justice in the form of violence if they resist. So glad Django blasted her in Bounty Hunter, and that Tyrannus put her out of my misery. Back to Galadron. The battle ensues. One of Django's men, Miles, is given the Maul treatment by one of the Jedi. Django single-handedly kills 5 of them, the last of whom being the one that killed Miles, and whom Django garroted with the line of his grappling hook. And I'm not going to lie, that last one was immensely satisfying for me personally because, I think the Jedi at this point were pretty arrogant and self-righteous. I mean, they've always had this, self-righteousness, but for once it came back to bite them in the ass. And when the battle's over, it turns out half the Jedi were killed, so, praise, Crom for small favors, as Razorfist would say. Django ultimately surrenders upon seeing all his comrades are dead, muttering, "We're all dead," and the battle ends with Dooku asking, "What have we done?" The scene then shifts back to Dooku reflecting that the battle was a misguided mission from the start and one of the Council's many mistakes. This and the death of his former Padawan likely contributed to him leaving the Jedi. Part 4, like the rest, begins 10 years before Episode 2, and Django ultimately telling Dooku of his escape from slavery on a spy ship and returning to Galatron and the governor who sold him into slavery, despite the fact slavery being illegal in the Republic. I might add. So, yeah, the Republic wasn't that great, as it turned out. Where he retrieved his now iconic set of armor and threatened Deathwatch's location out of the governor. I mean, the guy went full, I guess, meek, I guess. Like, there's no way to describe it. Django went full Django on him. Actually, no, there's a better way to describe it. He went full Clement II to Django's Django. Django attacks Deathwatch in Rocketeer fashion as they are approaching Corellia, but he and Vizsla end up in an escape pod and continue their fight on the surface. Honestly, it's like when Peter Griffin fights the giant chicken. You know those transitions in the background? Or like them going from place to place? It's like that, but more badass. The fight ends, Vizsla is dire cat chow, and Django wanders off to find a job, ultimately beginning his life as a bounty hunter soon after. Flash forward, Django agrees to become the template for the clone army in exchange for credits and an unaltered clone. Overall, I would say this is a great comic and story, as I would much of the gutted Star Wars Expanded Universe. Maybe I'm biased. Actually, no, scratch that. No, maybe about it. I am biased on this one for the record. It combines three things I love most about the Star Wars EU: bounty hunters, the Fets, and Mandalorians. Mainly Mandalorians and the Fets. And for fans of any of these, I recommend Open Season. If there's one complaint I have, it's that the ending left me wanting more, wanting to see Django become a bounty hunter, to see him acquire Jaster's legacy, the ship, and his ventures in the underworld before meeting Tyrannus. But then again, that lack of information works for Django just as it did for Boba. So, it just works. Sometimes less is more. Some other things I would say were a point of interest for me concerning this comic was its connections to the movies and the enlightenments it provided me at the time of reading it back in, I think, 2015 or 16, of Django's past outside the Bounty Hunter game and some motivations he may have had. Like, I knew some of this, but before, like, I would read this stuff online. But this really puts into perspective more, like, it has more impact for me reading it, why he did some of the things that he did. It confirms the extent of Django's knowledge of the clone army and what would eventually happen. Personally, I think that was a bonus for him on top of the pay and getting a son with no woman involved. Like much of the EU, this comic also shines a light on the Jedi's less desirable sides, which the films, for the most part, did not. And I'm always game for a few pot shots at those self-righteous sorcerers. This comic also showed the extent of how Dooku was a good character and complex man, unlike the Clone Wars, which mainly showed him, from the clips I've seen, as just evil. Lastly, this shows how the current writers of Star Wars, before the Disney Plus thing came up, and their shows have become rather derivative. One thing I've enjoyed about the EU is that, unlike the Disney Star Wars, it wasn't afraid to touch on or allude to dark or depressing subjects such as the Clone Commandos novels, or another one, I want to say the Death Troopers, about a virus on a ship or a drug addiction. Whereas, because everything with Disney has to be family friendly and sanitized like a cart at a store, the only way they'd let Star Wars be dark now is if it involved a skin pigmentation. Also, this story felt more original to me. It didn't feel like they were just copying and pasting what came before, which is something the sequel trilogy, I believe, did. It didn't just make up a new enemy, it just continued using the old one. For its story, artwork, and writing, I give Open Seasons either 4.5 or 5 out of 5 Mythosaurus skulls. Actually, no, 5 out of 5. This one for me is almost perfect and worth all the money I spent on it. Downside is if you want a physical copy, it costs more. And as I've mentioned before in my previous video about my thoughts on the Book of Boba Fett, I'm hoping they delve more into the expanded universe and try to incorporate it into stuff with the Boba Fett, or how it pertains to him and his dad. Because I would like to see more of Open Seasons be used, and not really the story itself. Although I do think Open Seasons and Bounty Hunter could have been made into a trilogy of movies, like have the first one be about Fett being adopted into the true Mandalorians and him rising up, and it ending with Jaster dying. The second one be about him leading the true Mandalorians for a while, their betrayal and destruction by the Jedi, and him getting revenge on Tor Vizsla, and escaping from slavery and all that. And then the third one just be about Bounty Hunter the game, and do it all in like they did the Clone Wars show, where it was all, I think, animated was what I heard it was. But yeah, I think they could have done that, but not for the Boba Fett show. I would say just maybe have him learning more about his heritage and what Jango went through, how he became the man he was. Yeah, I would love to see more of that being incorporated into it. But mostly, I think what I love about this is it just gives you all the context you need for how Jango became who he is. And to a small extent, as I mentioned before, it gave you some context for why Dooku left the Jedi Order, because that is something that the Clone Wars did that kind of annoyed me from what I've seen of it. It made him just evil. It didn't make him a complex character like he is in the books and the comics and the video games, because he had genuinely sympathetic motivations for doing the things he did. You may not like what he did, you may find what he did reprehensible, but he had a very sympathetic reason for doing it. I mean, he probably did more missions like what happened on Galadron that shook his belief in the Jedi, and then what happened to Qui-Gon just sealed the deal and made him quit. But yeah, he was, to me, he's a tragic character in the Star Wars series, a very tragic character. Same with Jango and Boba. There's an element of tragedy to what they've become. And I just like how this is just an anti-hero story. It's not about a good guy or a hero saving the day. It's just about about something that happened in the galaxy that the galaxy probably doesn't even care about. And this is one of many things that could happen in the galaxy every day under the Republic. So as much as people like to think the Republic was so great, it wasn't. It had problems. It was on a much like the Roman Republic of our world. It was on a decline and falling and degrading on its own. It probably would have fallen anyway without Palpatine's interference, but he accelerated it. But yeah, those are just my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments. If you've read Open Seasons, what do you think about it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you think it's overrated? And do you see the similarities between Din Djarin's origin to Jango's? Like anything you can talk about, really. Is the comment section. You can pretty much say anything. But that's all for now. Again, let me know your thoughts. And remember, the game was rigged from the start.